December, 1944. London had grown accustomed to death delivered by air. For 5 years, the city had tasted flame and rubble. It had learned to read the drone of engines, to measure danger in decibels and direction, to live by siren and shelter. The Vone-flying bomb, the doodle bug, had given even terror a rhythm. Engine, 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 silence, then impact. Londoners hated that silence but understood it. Sound was warning, silence was fate. But the weapon that arrived in December of 1944 offered no sound at all. At 0800 hours, on a cold blue morning, a shop girl on Mile End Road looked skyward because she thought she saw sunlight glint off glass. It was only for a heartbeat. She blinked, and an entire block vanished. No engine, no siren, no descending whine. Only a sudden pressure in the lungs, a pulse in the bones, a flash of white, and a roar that rolled over the East End like the wrath of a star. The first V2 strike on London did not explode in the city. It exploded through it. One moment, chimneys smoking, tram bells clanging, schoolboys in caps running late with books under arms. The next, 3 stories of flats collapsing inward like paper as a column of dust and masonry leapt into the sky. Windows shattered a quarter-mile away. Bodies were not torn apart, they were simply removed from existence, replaced by fragments and dust and silence. It came from nowhere. A constable stammered to a stunned rescue warden minutes later. No plane, no bomb, just God hit us. For the first time since the Blitz, London felt truly hunted again. But this time, the predator was invisible. In Westminster, the War Cabinet convened within minutes. Winston Churchill sat rigid, cigar smouldering between thick fingers, staring at the report. One strike, no warning, no interception possible. "What do we call it?" he asked, voice low. V2, replied Professor Frederick Lindemann, his scientific advisor. Vergeltungswaffe 2, retaliation weapon 2. Churchill exhaled smoke through clenched teeth. Retaliation for what? Lindemann did not answer. The truth hung between them. Hitler no longer sought military targets. He sought despair. The briefing that followed felt like a séance for a ghost of the future. Scientists spoke of supersonic velocities and ballistic trajectories, terms half the ministers had never heard before. The weapon, they explained, travelled faster than sound 2 to 3 times faster depending on altitude. By the time anyone heard its passage, the detonation had already occurred. The rocket reached nearly 60 miles altitude, arcing like fire shot by a god. It achieved terminal speeds no aircraft could match, and no anti-aircraft battery could track. "This is not an aeroplane," one physicist said quietly. "It is the first man-made object to touch the edge of space." A silence followed, one that no bomb could deepen. Churchill's bulldog jaw tightened. "And how many?" he demanded. Lindemann's voice was grave. "Our estimates suggest the Germans have completed approximately 6,000. Perhaps 3,000 are launch-ready." A minister paled. 6,000, and they require 30 times the industrial labour of their Vone weapons, another scientist added. Yet they built them anyway. Churchill's fist struck the table. "And the Luftwaffe starves for fuel, their tanks rust, their railways are ash. Yet this they fund? Why?" "Because, Prime Minister," Lindemann replied, "this is the first weapon in history that no defence can touch." The strikes continued, day after day, night after night, sometimes 3 in a day, sometimes 10. Each explosion carved a crater large enough to swallow a house. Each one arrived without warning, as though gravity itself chose to murder London at random. Men and women did not run when they heard it, they simply died where they stood. And the city whispered a new prayer, bitter and resigned. At least let it fall somewhere else. Newspapers printed nothing at first. Silence bred panic, but truth bred more. Rumour filled void, German space cannon, Hitler's vengeance bolts, even whispers of nuclear alchemy. The government denied, soothed, reassured. But Londoners were not fools. The earth shook. The sky stayed quiet, and terror spread like frost. Children slept in underground tunnels again. People listened for engines out of habit but found only silence. Silence became louder than screams once had. While London bled, Allied intelligence burned midnight oil. Files stamped Operation Crossbow filled tables in Whitehall. Reconnaissance photos of Peenemünde test stands before RAF bombers shattered them in August of 1943. Secret Polish reports smuggled through forests and rivers, fragment analyses of recovered debris, mathematical estimates scribbled by weary men who realized they were studying not a weapon, all of this war, but the first of the next. American analysts in Washington shared that dread. A young engineer at the Army Ordnance Department, reading British cables, whispered to a colleague, "If they can do this now, what happens in 10 years?" The colleague stared at the ceiling. "Then we lose the next war before it starts." Even Soviet intelligence, grimly efficient, understood. Stalin's agents reported that German scientists spoke of multi-stage rockets, of mile-long launch rails, of payloads far greater than 1 ton. The Kremlin dismissed much of it as propaganda, yet not all. In a vault beneath Moscow's Lubyanka prison, dossiers marked future strategic threat piled quietly higher. Yet, while rockets fell on London, the greater death toll lay hidden underground. At Mittelbau-Dora, in tunnels carved from Haar's mountain stone, tens of thousands of slave labourers died forging the V2's steel sinews. Men starved beside machinery, bodies fed ash pits as alloy fed mould. Engineers filed tolerances, while prisoners collapsed on assembly floors. More died building the rockets than the rockets ever killed tens of thousands, sacrificed to birth a machine that promised death from the stratosphere. This was the unseen ledger of the V2, German science at its most brilliant, German cruelty at its most absolute. In London, they saw only the flash and the crater. They did not yet see the cost. By winter's end, the V2 bombardment would kill thousands in London and Antwerp, but its true casualty was certainty. For the first time, the modern world glimpsed the shape of wars to come. Not fleets, not divisions, not dogfights in the clouds, but arcs drawn by mathematics, flight paths inked by gravity, destruction delivered from beyond the sky. Hitler had not won. His rockets arrived too late, his empire rotted from within, his armies bled dry on Russian snow and French hedgerow. But in the fire and dust of London's streets, Allied leaders understood something chilling. Germany had reached into the future and almost brought it crashing down upon them. And as rescue crews dug for survivors on Mile End Road, Churchill stood at the cabinet window, staring at the city he loved. Behind him lay charts of trajectories, explosive yields, future projections. Ahead of him lay a horizon suddenly filled with rockets. "This," he murmured, more to history than to those in the room, "is a doorway, and God help mankind when it walks through." January 1945. Snow drifted along the desolate Baltic coast, gathering in white ridges around the twisted metal ribs and scorched concrete pads of Peenemünde. Here, on Germany's bleak northern shore, the future had first taken shape. And here, Allied intelligence officers now walked like archaeologists among the ruins of a civilization that had tried to leap decades ahead and almost succeeded. Peenemünde was not a battlefield. It was an excavation site of terror and brilliance. American technical intelligence teams moved carefully over the frozen ground, boots crunching as they documented blast pits, fuel lines, concrete launch slabs blackened by exhaust that had burned hotter than any engine alive. There were fragments of guidance vanes, pieces of turbo pumps, and scorched shards of thin-walled steel tanks, all catalogued, photographed, and boxed for transport. One officer bent, lifted a charred stabilizer fin, and whispered, "This is not a bomb. It's a machine built to touch space." His sergeant only nodded. In this place, even the wind seemed to acknowledge awe. The British had struck Peenemünde first, Operation Hydra, August of 1943. The raid had killed engineers and workers, forcing the Germans to move production underground. The RAF had aimed to kill a weapon. Instead, they scattered its seeds into mountain caverns where secrecy protected it further. Now, Allied men sifted the ashes of what had survived. Major Robert Staver of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. Thin, intense, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, walked beside Colonel Holger Toftoy, commander of the U.S. rocket intelligence effort. They were cold, tired, and exhilarated. "Look at the test stands," Toftoy murmured. Concrete blast trays angled to vent exhaust. Service towers. Rail spurs to bring oxygen tanks. They built a spaceport before the world even had jetliners. Staver ran a gloved hand across the scorched concrete. This wasn't improvisation. This was program management on a national scale. Facilities, logistics, metallurgy, guidance, fuels. God, they built all this in the middle of a war. Behind him, a junior officer called out, voice quivering. "Sir, we found a guidance section intact." They hurried over. There, half buried in ice, lay the heart of the V2's brain. Gyroscopes, manual electrical servos, steering vanes of heat-resistant graphite designed to deflect rocket exhaust hotter than molten steel. Primitive by later standards, but in 1945, it was like discovering alien engineering. Staver crouched, brushing frost from delicate metal rings. 3-axis stabilization, powered by mechanical gyros and feedback amplifiers. They solved inertial guidance in wartime. He looked up at Toftoy, voice hushed. If they'd had 2 more years, Toftoy finished for him. London would be dust. The German documents were harder to read than the wreckage. After the RAF bombings, the engineers had evacuated thousands of drawings, calculations, and manufacturing plans, but fires and sabotage had destroyed many. The Allies found fragments, thrust equations, wiring diagrams, turbo pump notes, and one chilling directive stamped with the seal of the SS. Output priority, 1,000 rockets per month. Staver stared at it, stunned. Impossible. They barely had fuel for their trucks, yet they dream of 1,000 rockets a month. A captured German technician, trembling in an RAF interrogation hut, answered quietly. They meant to build less tank and more rocket. The Allies realized the true horror. Germany had not been starved of ambition, only time. Peenemünde revealed something else. Germany's war had become 2 wars. One visible in mud and trenches, another hidden in laboratories and factories. At Normandy, American GIs fought men with Mausers and Panzerfausts. But here, jacketed against Baltic wind, Allied officers confronted a weapon that made rifles and tanks feel like relics. The V2 was wasteful, inefficient, catastrophically expensive, yet it worked. And it pointed to a world where bombs would fall not from aircraft, but from trajectories drawn by astronomers. Staver picked up a shard of graphite steering vane. Today, a ton of explosives. Tomorrow, God knows. God and the physicists, Toftoy replied. Both men thought the same forbidden word. Atomic. In London, the cabinet had asked whether Hitler could place gas in a V2 warhead. Scientists reassured them. The stresses of re-entry would shatter glass ampoules, destroy chemical fillings. But here, in the ruins, a German engineer's notebook listed chilling research: reinforced warhead, heat shielding, increased structural load, radiological dispersion possibility under development. Staver froze. They were thinking of it. Even if they couldn't do it, they were thinking. War had nearly met physics at the edge of apocalypse. And then there were the human ghosts. On a wall, faint under smoke stains and grime, a labourer had scratched a message in Polish, "We built death in the dark." At Dora Mittelbau, deeper horrors still waited for discovery. But here the engineers felt the first sting of guilt. The rocket had not only killed Londoners, it had consumed the lives of thousands who laboured, starved, and died beneath mountains for the dream of one man. Toftoy stared toward the Baltic Sea. When we defeat them, we must control this technology. If we do not, someone else will. It was not fear of Germany anymore, it was fear of the world that would follow. Staver nodded slowly. Then we take the men who built it. Every one we can find. A wind gust carried snow across the ruins. Behind them, officers marked crates for shipment. USA, top secret, return soonest. The race had already begun. Not the race for Berlin, that battle was nearly won. This was the race for tomorrow. A rocket, born in tyranny, had revealed the future. And the Allies had one terrifying realization. Victory on the battlefield did not mean safety. The war would end in months. The age it had awakened would last centuries. Autumn, 1945. Cuxhaven, northern Germany. Sea mist rolled in from the North Sea in long grey sheets, coating everything: trucks, scaffolding, crates with a thin saline crust. On an abandoned Wehrmacht airfield, now taken over by the British occupation forces, a strange mechanical forest had risen. Cranes, winches, fuel tanks, liquid oxygen dewars venting ghostly vapour. At the centre of it all stood something no Allied soldier had ever expected to see upright outside a nightmare intelligence report: a complete V-2 rocket. 46 feet of silvered steel, its nose cone knife-sharp, its fins blackened from prior tests. The first ballistic missile ever built by man, and the Allies were about to fire it. Work crews wore oil-stained coveralls. RAF camera teams perched behind reinforced glass bunkers, film rolling. Royal engineers reviewed wiring diagrams with German scientists who only months earlier had served the Third Reich. The scene looked less like a wartime field site than a temple to some new and frightening mechanical god. Major James Tilling, Royal Engineers, turned to his interpreter. "Ask him again about the fuel mixture ratio." The German chief technician, thin face, hollow cheeks, posture half military, half defeated engineer, answered, quickly. 75% ethanol, 25 water, mixed precisely, and liquid oxygen. If the LOX feed fluctuates during ignition, he lifted both hands, mimicking an explosion. The British officer grunted, charming. And the turbo pump? The German tapped the side of his head. 2-stage steam turbine. Hydrogen peroxide reacts with permanganate catalyst. If valve sticks, boom again. Boom again. The British scribbled that down. Everything about the V2, they were discovering, existed on the knife edge between scientific genius and catastrophic fragility. Every pipe, every seal, every bolt demanded precision Germany could barely maintain while its cities burned. That they had built thousands under air raids, and starvation was not just astonishing, it was terrifying. A Royal Navy officer leaned toward Tilling. "I saw Spitfires shoot down V1s. You could fight those. This," he nodded at the rocket, "this you just endure." At the viewing, bunker, Allied brass gathered. RAF Air Vice Marshal Roderick Carr, British scientists from Farnborough, American liaisons from Aberdeen Proving Ground, and intelligence officers from OSS and MI6. Each bore the same expression, a strained mix of curiosity and dread. "Doctor," John Hemsley, physicist, murmured to an American colonel. "If Germany had married this with a guidance breakthrough radio command, radar terminal update, anything London becomes undefendable. Not just London, Paris, Moscow, any city." The colonel nodded grimly. "And if they'd had nuclear material?" Hemsley swallowed. "They wouldn't need to hit a target, just a city." There it was, the ghost at the edge of every Allied planning document. The V2 could have been a nuclear delivery system before bombers were obsolete, decades before ICBMs. The war had ended just short of a darker world. The fueling began. Engineers in insulated suits guided umbilicals into ports along the rocket's flank. Liquid. Oxygen hissed like an angry serpent, spilling cold fog along the ground. The metal skin crackled as it contracted. Spectators shifted nervously. Unlike airplanes or artillery, rockets groaned, flexed, and breathed when filled. They felt alive, a predator waking. The German chief engineer whispered to a British officer, almost reverent, Wir haben das Tor zu den Sternen gebaut. We built the gate to the stars. The officer replied without looking at him. You built a gate to kill civilians. The German's jaw tightened. Pride and guilt warred across his face. A hush fell. A klaxon sounded. The launch conductor raised a gloved hand. Zehn. The German countdown. The Allies let them speak it. Only they had ever done this before. Neun, acht, sieben. Camera shutters cocked. Binoculars steadied. Sechs, fünf. Frost blossomed across the rocket's body, cracking like ice on a winter river. Vier, drei. Steam roared from the nozzle. Zwei. Silence so complete it strangled breath. Eins. A white jet stabbed downward, then orange flame erupted, radiant and violent, expanding into a roaring spear of fire. Sandbags jolted. Metal trembled. Jackets snapped in the shockwave. The V2 lifted slowly, impossibly like a cathedral rising, shivering against gravity until it tore free and screamed skyward, leaving a pillar of fire that painted the morning sky. The sound hit an instant later a ripping thunder, deeper than any engine, older than any battlefield. In seconds, it vanished into the cloud ceiling, leaving only a boiling plume and the smell of burnt alcohol and ozone. The assembled officers stood frozen. One whispered, barely audible, "Dear God, it works." Another murmured, "We did not defeat the rocket, we outran it." Telemetry crackled in the control hut. Impact zone, North Sea. Flight nominal. Guidance correct within wartime tolerance. Everything functioned. Fuel feeds, turbopumps. Gyros. Vannes. The dream or nightmare worked perfectly. The German engineers exchanged glances. For a moment, they forgot defeat. They had built something no one else had. Then they remembered where they stood, and pride curdled into shame. Major Tilling stepped outside into the sea wind. His notebook trembled slightly in his hand. He wrote only one line. "The next war will begin with machines like this." Behind him, a British officer spoke quietly to an American counterpart. If Hitler had chosen rockets over tanks in 1942, the American finished the thought, Europe would be ash under a supersonic sky. They stood silent. The V2 had not saved the Reich, but it had introduced the future, a future measured not in miles of trench nor fleets of bombers, but in trajectories and thrust, in physics and fear. And every man watching knew, humanity had crossed a threshold. There would be no crossing back. Spring, 1945. White Sands. Proving ground, New Mexico. A train clattered across the desert under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow steel and thought alike. On its flat cars lay the disassembled bones of 20 captured V2 rockets, each strapped down like the carcass of some mythic beast dragged from a battlefield. Soldiers smoked in the heat. Engineers clutched notebooks heavy with equations and terror. At the end of the train sat 2 German scientists under guard. Their uniforms were gone. They wore U.S. Army issue khaki, ill-fitting and symbolic. Their new masters called this Operation Paperclip. Their old Reich called it treason. Dr. Magnus Richter, once chief of a guidance subsection at Peenemünde, watched the desert blur past. His partner, a soft-spoken propulsion specialist named Schneider, whispered, "If Hitler had given us 2 more years..." Richter shook his head. "No, if he had given us diesel and bread instead of ideology." There was bitterness there, pride too. Genius doesn't surrender gracefully. But there was also fear, for men like Richter now lived in a world where governments measured intellect not by brilliance, but by usefulness. The Americans on board didn't speak to them, but they listened every time the wind carried German murmurs down the railcars. The dismantling bays at White Sands were quiet cathedrals of steel, light, and chalk dust. American technicians, Lockheed men, MIT physicists, Army ordnance veterans gathered around crates stamped with German eagles now slashed by white paint. They pried open one crate, expecting simple pipes and tanks. Inside lay a gyroscopic platform, 3 nested rings, dual bearings, feedback potentiometers, a masterful arrangement of servos and springs. A machine that could sense tilt without the stars, without radio, without pilots. Captain Ernest Lang, West Point class of 1937, stared. "This isn't engineering," he whispered. "This is prophecy." Beside him, Dr. Charles Vickery of Caltech ran fingers over the brass casing, almost reverent. "This is navigation freed from air and earth. No pilot, no horizon. It knows where it is because it measures its own doubt." The American sergeant next to them blinked. "It measures doubt?" Vickery nodded. "It corrects itself not when it fails, but when it thinks it might." Behind them, German technician Schneider muttered softly in his native tongue. "Every machine is a child of its time. This one was born ahead of its father." The rocket's shell came next, thin, chrome molybdenum steel barely more than a few millimeters thick. The Americans tapped it in disbelief. How did this not tear apart? Richter, guarded, answered, "Mathematics and fear. We tested to failure until fear became knowledge." Fear became knowledge. That phrase would linger. They moved next to the engine, a bell of steel and graphite, scarred and pitted but still magnificent, fuel lines like arteries, injector plates drilled with hundreds of perfect apertures, a turbopump the size of a man's head capable of inhaling thousands of gallons per minute. Lieutenant Hayes traced one pipe with a pencil. "This isn't a bomb, it's a factory of fire." Richter finally spoke, softly. "It is a door." "A door to what?" Hayes asked. "To anywhere." At evening mess, American officers debated in low voices. "We bombed their factories to dust," one said. "We burned their cities. And they built this." Another shook his head. "Imagine if Hitler had valued engineers as much as parades." But Dr. Hemsley, the British physicist visiting White Sands, cut in coldly. He valued engineers. But he valued death more. That is why he failed. The room quieted. "Genius without morality," Hemsley continued, "is machinery without brakes." Someone whispered. "And what are we building here?" No one answered. Outside, desert winds swept across launch pads where American crews practiced lifting mock rocket stages. Young G. Ice laughed, smoked, cursed the heat, unaware they stood at the edge of humanity's next battlefield. A sergeant shouted as a crane swung too wide. "If this thing drops, boys, we'll invent the jet age again." Laughter. Nervous, thin, even humor bent under the weight of what they were touching. At night, the desert was silent except for coyotes. The Germans sat apart, staring up at Orion, the Milky Way. Distant worlds they once dreamed their rockets might reach as explorers, not executioners. Schneider whispered. "We wanted to touch the moon." Richter answered. "We did, but first we fell through hell." The Americans ran the numbers, 1 V2 required. More than 30 times the industrial labor of Avon refining facilities for liquid oxygen, high-grade steel. Germany was starving of precision machining beyond what most factories in the world could produce, and yet, the Third Reich starving, collapsing, burning had built 6,000 of them. Lieutenant Hayes wrote in his diary, "We killed their army, we crushed their navy, we outbuilt their air force, but their scientists fought the next war and very nearly won it." The test schedule was set. Soon, at White Sands, a captured German rocket would rise again not as a Nazi weapon, but as the first torch in a new age. American officers gathered around a chalkboard where someone had written, "This is not a German rocket. This is the first American space program." But someone had crossed out space and written, "Missile, 2 futures, 1 destiny." The desert breeze lifted chalk dust. Men stared at the board, and for once no one spoke. They all knew the world had already changed. They were no longer engineers of war, they were midwives to history itself. And the child they delivered would one day reach the stars or burn the earth to ash. Spring 1945. Thuringian Mountains, Germany. The entrance to Mittelwerk yawned like the mouth of a tomb. Cold air seeped from the tunnel, damp, metallic, heavy with oil, stone dust, and something older human despair fossilized into air itself. American soldiers stepped quietly inside, rifles raised, boots crunching over gravel and broken slate, their breath fogged in the lantern light. Ahead, the darkness swallowed sound and hope alike. This was not a laboratory, not a factory. This was a mausoleum that built the future. On the walls, faint chalk markings, shift codes, batch numbers, scribbled equations, and here and there scratches of names, prayers, warnings in Polish, Czech, French, Russian, Dutch. There were tally marks too, hundreds, thousands, a record of days survived or men lost, or both. Private Arthur Mulholland, 20 years old, New Jersey steel mill worker turned infantryman, whispered, "It's like walking into hell." His sergeant answered without humor, "No, son, hell's warmer." Floodlights flickered on, revealing the vast caverns stretched before them. Rail tracks running into the black, scaffolding reaching up like scaffolds in a gallows yard. Pieces of rockets laid out like mechanical corpses awaiting resurrection. And bodies. They were not hidden. They were not buried. They lay in corners, under tarps, beside machine lathes, stacked near supply crates labelled in stenciled Gothic script. Hollow faces, limbs thin as wire, fingers curled like dead leaves. Mulholland gagged. Christ, Christ Almighty. A captured German foreman stood nearby, wrists bound, eyes hollow. He spoke softly through an interpreter. They worked until they died. Then others took their place. "How many?" Captain James Leland asked. The German swallowed. "Thousands." A second, shameful correction. "Tens of thousands." Nearby, Lieutenant Robert Eberly, Army Signal Corps photographer, lifted his camera with trembling hands. Click, flash, click, flash. Each photograph was part of a ledger of war crimes, proof of a truth too monstrous to deny. Later, in years of peace, when rockets rose to the heavens, these images would serve as anchors, a reminder that human flight to the stars began in a place where men died underground by the thousands, unseen by the sun. Deeper they went. A massive rocket Venturi cone sat on its cradle, charred, elegant, lethal. Alloy tubing snaked like veins across the floor. Graphite veins glimmered in flashlight beams. Engineers trailed behind soldiers, notebooks shaking. Colonel Holger Toftoy of U.S. Ordnance paused by a guidance gyroscope assembly, delicate as a watchmaker's masterpiece. One of his men whispered, "Sir, this is the greatest engineering achievement of the war." Toftoy's jaw clenched. He looked at the corpses laid beside the machinery. "No," he said quietly, "this is the greatest crime of the war." He touched the steel fin of a V2 and recoiled. The metal was cold, but what clung to it was colder. The voices of men who had died building it, grinding parts with hands that bled, assembling guidance rings while starving, dragging oxygen tanks until lungs collapsed. A sign above a chamber read, "Arbeit schützt, nicht vor Tod." Work does not protect from death. A bitter invert of the camp lies at Auschwitz. Here they did not bother to lie. As they reached Chamber 74, they found rows of wooden bunks stacked 5 high, blankets stiff with dirt and sweat, buckets overflowing, strips of cloth that had been shoes, bent spoons, bones, and scratched into the wall. "We built rockets, they built our graves," Mulholland whispered, voice breaking. "They weren't soldiers, they were slaves." A Polish survivor, ribs like piano keys under his ragged shirt, stood against a wall under guard, too weak to stand unaided. Through cracked lips, he whispered a single sentence in English. For every rocket, 10 men died. Historians later estimated a number close to truth. Nearly 20,000 dead building 6,000 rockets. More killed in making the V2 than by firing them. Toftoy turned to the American engineers. Never forget what bought this technology. Outside, the sun struck their eyes like a rebuke. Engineers scribbled notes. Soldiers chain-smoked. Some men simply stared at the horizon, trying to process what they had seen. Major Staver approached Toftoy. We could destroy it all, burn the plans, bury the equipment, let rockets die here, where they belong. Toftoy stared at the mountains. The wind carried faint echoes from the tunnel's metal clinks. Memory? Horror? If we don't take this knowledge, he answered, others will. The Soviets are already moving, and this weapon will return one day, either in our hands or against us. Staver closed his eyes. And the people who made it? Toftoy spoke like a man delivering a sentence on history. Their suffering will not be undone. But we can prevent future suffering by learning what they built. A pause. And by remembering who paid for it. That night, as campfires flickered, the Americans lay awake. Some dreamt of factories of death. Others dreamt of rockets rising toward stars. A few dreamt of both at once and woke sweating, knowing the future could resemble either. The dawn came red and bleak. Orders crackled on radio sets, crates to be shipped to America, technicians and scientists to be questioned, documentation to be seized. Soviet columns approaching from the east. The race had entered its next phase. War had ended. The struggle for the future had begun. And the ghosts of Dora marched silently beside the engineers, who would build that future, a reminder etched in every blueprint, every launch pad, every rocket's roar. Progress without humanity becomes genocide wearing gears. Early summer, 1945. Blockhaus d'Epaulex, near Whitehall, France. Deep in the French woods stood a concrete mountain, a colossal bunker, walls thick as fortresses, its roof a wounded slab shattered by Allied bombs. Moss crept along cracks left by tallboy earthquakes. Birds nested where war machines once roared. And now, Allied commanders and engineers walked the ruins with slow, reverent steps. It was here the Germans had planned to mass-produce and fire V-2 rockets in industrial quantities. Not handfuls, not dozens, hundreds, per month. General William Kepner, 9th Air Force, removed his cap. Dear God! They tried to build a factory for ballistic missiles. Major Thomas Rawlings, Army Intelligence, kicked at broken rebar. They built an assembly line for space weapons in 1943. It did not feel like a relic of the war just won. It felt like a prophecy of wars not yet imagined. The floor of the bunker stretched cavernous and endless, as if carved by giants. Elevator pits designed to lift rockets upright for fueling yawned in shadows. Blast ducts tunneled like arteries. Fuel tanks lay ruptured, but their purpose was clear. Liquid oxygen by the thousands of gallons. An RAF officer murmured to his counterpart, "This is Cape Canaveral built in hell." Another replied quietly, "Or Baikonur." Names for launch sites not yet conceived hung unspoken in the air. American Colonel Irwin Laidlaw ran his hand across the cold concrete. If they'd finished this, Captain Rawlings completed it. London becomes a footnote. Antwerp, Brussels, Moscow too. No warning systems, no air defense. Nothing stops them. Even victory could feel like a narrow escape when staring into a future barely avoided. Inside the bunker's command gallery lay a scorched blueprint tube. Engineers unrolled it gingerly. On the paper, astonishingly preserved, were diagrams of automated hoists, fuel processing lines, and loading platforms. Efficient, industrial, scaled. The lead engineer, Dr. Arthur Dunlop, swallowed hard. This wasn't a terror weapon. This was a prototype missile base. A clerk whispered. They wanted hundreds a month. Dunlop corrected him, voice hollow. They wanted thousands a year. The men around him looked stricken. The realization settled. The Allies had not beaten German rocket science through superior technology. They had beaten it by bombing their fuel plants, starving their industry, and reaching Berlin first. Raw power, raw steel, logistics, not genius, had won the race. Yet as they studied the ruins, awe mingled with dread. British physicist Dr. Henry Wainwright stood silently, eyes on a half-assembled guidance platform. Imagine this, but refined. radio correction, precision guidance, perhaps wings for glide, reusable descent. He trailed off, knowing the implication. The line between a V-2 and a spaceplane was only time and equations. And nuclear warheads, an American officer added. No one disagreed. Later, in a makeshift field hut outside, the bunker, Allied planners convened around a folding table. Cigarette smoke curled toward a canvas roof. Rain tapped in steady rhythm. Each man held intelligence summaries, charts, and captured German correspondence. Major Rawlings spoke first, his voice careful. The Panzers lost the war. The rockets could have won it. In 5 years, maybe less, if they had survived long enough. General Kepner leaned back. Hitler built tanks he couldn't fuel, planes he couldn't finish. But this was different. A British officer nodded. This was a weapon not limited by battlefield distance. Today, London. Tomorrow, New York. Silence spread like frost. And if they had perfected guidance? Another murmured. Imagine a rocket able to land within a block. Wainwright added quietly. The V-2 is not Hitler's last weapon. It is humanity's first step into a more dangerous world. A captured German memo was passed around. Typed, stamped, signed. Its language, clinical, confident, chilling. Long-term objective, transatlantic rocket capability, capable of delivering 1-ton warhead to eastern seaboard. Beside it, another document, a crude sketch labeled America Rakete, a German dream, but not fantasy. In the shadows of these vaults, men had imagined iron rain falling on Manhattan from suborbital flight. Rawlings stared at the drawing. What saved New York? General Kepner answered without hesitation. Time, and our bombers, and God. Because science alone doesn't choose morality, men do. The meeting adjourned, but 2 engineers remained, staring at the concrete giant slumbering in the forest. Wainwright looked tired. We must take this knowledge, develop it, master it. His companion frowned. And use it for what? Rockets falling on cities again? Wainwright exhaled slowly. Or rockets reaching beyond them. The same vehicle that destroys London could carry a telescope to orbit. Or a man to the moon. So the future is decided here, the younger man said, in a ruined bunker built by slaves. Wainwright nodded. The past carved the doorway. We must decide how to walk through. As the Allied convoy pulled away, a gust of wind rustled loose blueprints, scattering them like leaves across concrete floors. Diagrams of veins, pump curves, fuel ratios, dreams and nightmares in ink. Behind them, the enormous bunker stood unmoving, an unfinished temple to a dead empire and a newborn age. The V-2 had not saved the Reich, but it had changed the species. War had not merely destroyed nations, it had accelerated tomorrow. When the last truck vanished beyond the trees, silence reclaimed the ruins. Birds returned. Moss continued its quiet conquest. Human footsteps faded, but knowledge never unlearns itself. And in laboratories from New Mexico to Moscow, men were already sketching rockets larger than any Peenemünde engineer dared propose, taller, faster, capable of crossing oceans and, one day, worlds. The future had been delayed, not prevented, because for all its horror, the V-2 had proven one simple, irreversible truth. Earth would no longer contain humanity. Whether that future led upward to the stars or downward into ash, that choice now belonged to those who inherited the rocket's legacy. And history would remember. The desert dawn came cold and violet, the kind of stillness where the world holds its breath. A lone rocket, slender, black and white, alien against the sand, waited on its launch pad. To farmers and ranchers watching from distant ranches, it looked like something fallen from a science fiction magazine. To the gathered military officers, engineers, and foreign scientists under guard, it looked like the beginning of an arms race the world did not yet understand. To the surviving German engineers, it looked like déjà vu Peenemünde reborn under a different flag. Project name, Hermes. Objective, understand, replicate, surpass the V2. Subtext whispered among officers, keep pace with the Soviets. Colonel Holger Toftoy surveyed the assembly. Beside him stood Major Robert Staver, paper notes clipped to his clipboard with trembling fingers. Dr. Charles Vickery of Caltech paced, murmuring equations under his breath. Further back, guarded and silent, stood Dr. Magnus Richter and 3 other Peenemünde veterans, stripped of rank but still carrying the weight of dangerous knowledge. A klaxon cried once. Cameras clicked. A hush fell across the desert. "Stand by for count," called the range officer. Static crackled through loudspeakers. T-minus 60 seconds. For a moment, there was no war. No Reich, no camps, no cities in ash, only the towering machine and the future balanced on its nose cone. In the control bunker, banks of army radios and improvised oscilloscope screens flickered. Technicians hunched over panels built from salvaged V2 hardware and American vacuum tubes. Every man was sweating. Major Staver adjusted binoculars and whispered to Toftoy, "If this works, we jump 20 years overnight." Toftoy didn't blink. If this works, war becomes mathematics. Behind them, a British liaison lowered his head. And if it fails? Toftoy's answer was simple. Then the Soviets will learn it first. The words chilled the room more than desert dawn. 10 seconds. A low rumble built in the ground, subtle at first, then rising like thunder sealed in steel. Fuel pumps whined. Turbines screamed awake. Vapor hissed around the fins like breath. Richter closed his eyes. He had stood in this moment too many times before. But this time, the flag behind him was not the one he swore to, but the one he surrendered to. He whispered not to the rocket, but to himself. Mach keine Fehler. Do not fail. A guard beside him glanced nervously. Is he praying? Richter replied without opening his eyes. No, I am remembering. Ignition. White flame erupted downward, blasting sand into storm clouds. Concrete scorched. The sound hit seconds later, a physical force that rattled ribs and hearts alike. The rocket rose. Slowly at first, almost reluctant, then faster, climbing with a grace no artillery shell ever knew, a spear lifted by invisible hands. Inside the bunker, a technician screamed, "Telemetry stable! Pump velocity increasing, chamber stable guidance, gyros online." And Major Staver whispered the truth the world was learning in real time. It flies itself. 2 miles away, Navajo laborers paused, loading railway crates, and stared. A ranch family shaded their eyes. Children squealed at the sight. To one little boy clapping at the rising comet, it looked like magic. To his father, who had fought in France, it looked like menace. "Papa," the boy asked, "what is it?" His father answered quietly, "A weapon that wants to be a star." Back in the control room, a monitor needle jittered. Altitude rising, 15,000 feet, Mach 1.4. Trajectory nominal. A cheer broke prematurely, and then alarms shrieked. One needle spiked, another froze. Fuel pressure dropping. Guidance fault servo 3 not responding. Aux line vibration. In the sky above, the rocket shuddered, wobbled, then righted itself again. The room exhaled. Richter did not flinch. He whispered, "Stubborn child." The rocket climbed higher. At 60 miles altitude, the telemetry officer cried, "Apogee achieved, telemetry confirmed, re-entry phase beginning." Men shouted. Others silently sat, overwhelmed. A few wept. Where once rockets had carried hatred into the sky, now they carried dawning possibility. Some felt pride. Some felt dread. Most felt both. When the rocket finally broke apart over the desert planned, expected fragments rained like meteor dust. A sergeant whispered to another, "I think we just saw the first step to Mars." The reply came sharp and sober, "No, we just saw the first step to global annihilation. Progress and doom, twin children of the same father." Hours later, in a briefing tent smelling of dust and coffee, the reports came in. Success. Partial. Valuable. terrifying. A chalkboard listed lessons learned. Another listed Soviet movements in Thuringia. One officer argued to scrap all rocket work, they are abominations. Another demanded immediate escalations. If we don't build them, someone else will. Wainwright, the British physicist, stood at the centre. The V2 is not a weapon of victory, he said. It is a weapon of warning. In the wrong hands, someone muttered. Wainwright shook his head. In any hands. Night fell. Desert stars glimmered cold and perfect. The launch pad lay silent, blackened. Holy modern men had lit a fire that ancient priests only dreamed of. Richter sat alone on the sand, staring at Orion as he once did in Germany. Toftoy approached, slow steps crunching. You saw it fly, the colonel said. Richter nodded. Toftoy studied his face. You think it should have died in Peenemünde? Richter answered in a voice carved from exhaustion and memory. In Peenemünde we built it for death. Here, perhaps, it might lead to life. Do you believe that? Toftoy asked. Richter looked at the stars. I want to. And far above them, invisible to the naked eye, fragments of the day's rocket still burned in thin air, traces of the old world dissolving into the birth of a new one. Where the V2 once carried terror, its descendants would carry either warheads or human footsteps to the moon. The difference would depend on what mankind chose to worship, fear or the horizon. For now, rockets stood silent in the desert wind, waiting for the decision. Begin Chapter 8, The Shadow Race. Begins Fort Bliss, Texas winter, 1945 into 1946. The desert night wind carried grit across floodlit fencing and barracks rows. Guards walked watchtowers with rifles slung tight, breath visible like ghosts under searchlights. Inside, a Quonset hut hastily converted into an engineering bay. American officers bent over schematics taped to plywood boards. The drawings were German, the handwriting precise, angular annotated, now with American measurements, English script, and red pencil marks. Outside, trucks arrived every hour, unloading crates stenciled simply. V2 components handle with care Ordnance Command. Most of the men unloading them never knew what those crates held. Most of the officers studying them barely did. But everyone knew something immense was unfolding, something secret, something that would rewrite war. The V2 had not merely been captured, it was being reborn. At a long wooden table, Colonel Toftoy addressed the motley audience of American scientists, army officers, and a dozen German engineers seated under guard. The stove at the rear rattled with heat. The mood, like the air, was dry and brittle. You are not welcome guests, he began, staring hard at the German contingent, but you are necessary ones. No one moved. Peenemünde created the first weapon capable of striking across continents. Hitler did not live to finish it. Stalin intends to. He tapped the chalkboard twice. Soviet acquisitions. Thuringia, Blecherode, Nordhausen. Intelligence reports confirm Soviet capture of key personnel and facilities. They have the same blueprints you saw today. A murmur rippled. One of the German engineers, Dr. Franz Berger, once of guidance systems, shifted uneasily. These rockets, Toftoy continued, are not trophies, they are warnings. If the next war comes, and make no mistake, gentlemen, it may the side with rockets wins first, and the side without them does not win at all. He let the words settle like dust after dew. Artillery fire. You are here to ensure this country stands on the winning side again. Across the room, young Lieutenant Joe Donovan, fresh from the Pacific and still unaccustomed to speaking indoors without glancing for snipers, stared at the Germans. His brother's bomber crew had vanished over Hamburg, swallowed by flak and fire. And yet here he was ordered to learn from the men who built the weapons of a regime he'd fought to destroy. It gnawed at him. During the break, he approached Dr. Berger, voice low. My brother's B-17 never came home. Why should I help you? Berger did not flinch. He looked older than his age, lines carved by both genius and shame. I cannot defend what we served, Berger said quietly. I only tell you this. The Soviets would kill to have what we know. Some already died, refusing to go east. He held Donovan's gaze. You have two choices, Lieutenant. Use our knowledge, or let your enemies use it first. Donovan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The war had taught him one truth. Patriotism sometimes meant holding hands with ghosts. White Sands Proving Ground. 2 weeks later, the second American assembled V-2 stood poised under desert sunlight. This time, the scaffolding and fueling trucks bore white stars. The guidance van held American-built oscilloscopes. The launch team spoke English and Oklahoma drawl instead of Hanseatic, German and Austrian tenor. Yet the air had the same tense electricity as Peenemünde test film reels the Allies had seized. A British observer murmured, In 1932, we thought rockets were science fiction. In 1942, we wished they were. In 1946, we fear they are prophecy. The countdown ran. Ignition roared like the center of the earth tearing open, and the rocket failed. It lifted 20 feet, sputtered, twisted sideways, and came back down in a sheet of white flame, exploding in a thunderclap that rolled across the desert like a breaking mountain. Shrapnel hissed into sand. Radio screamed with static and panic. From the bunker, Donovan shouted into his headset, Emergency crews move! The rocket pit burned molten white-orange. Fuel tanks boiled. A second shockwave blew the windshield out of a jeep. In the chaos, one German stood completely still. Richter, once of guidance design at Peenemünde, simply watched the rising mushroom of dust, face unreadable. An American captain spun on him. You laughing at us? Richter's reply came slow, flat. No. I am remembering how many of mine died the same way. A long silence fell. The resentment in the captain's jaw eased, not gone, but softened. Rockets did not care about flags. Rockets devoured pride and blood equally. These machines were beyond nationalism. They answered only to physics and human ambition. Later that night, inside the engineering bay, Richter traced equations with chalk. Donovan leaned over his shoulder. Their two worlds, once divided by oceans and ideology, now shared the same formulae, same fears. It pre-ignited in the turbopump line, Donovan said. Richter nodded. Your gasket tolerances are wrong for alcohol mixture ratios. Too hot, too weak. German bearings used manganese steel. Your substitute war nickel cannot endure the thermal load. Half impressed, half bitter. Even your failures are specific. Richter smiled faintly, the ghost of pride, the shadow of regret. No, Lieutenant, our failures were universal. You are here to avoid repeating them. Donovan stared at the white dog-eared drawings of combustion chambers and gyroscopes pinned to the wall, and for the first time he understood the terrifying beauty of the thing they were taming. Rocketry was no longer the dream of fiction. It was the new artillery of nations. Washington, D.C. Pentagon Sub-Basement Spring, 1946 A classified briefing room. Chalkboards filled with equations. A single headline tacked on corkboard. Soviets launch rocket program. German scientists reported East Toftoy stood before a circle of generals. Gentlemen, we are no longer competing with ghosts of the Reich. We are racing the future. A general asked, how long until these weapons can cross an ocean? Richter, under guard but unshackled, answered before Toftoy could, with time and resources 7 years. And deliver what payload? The room tensed. Richter looked him dead in the eye. Anything you fear enough to build one for. Silence, heavy, absolute. From the ashes of one tyranny, another contest began, not of trench lines or tank divisions, but of math, metallurgy, and the men who once served evil now pressed into service of the free world. And outside the Pentagon walls, civilians walked under cherry blossoms, unaware that the next war, if it came, would not roar like artillery. It would arrive from silence, from sky, from the edge of space. The age of rockets had begun, and the clock had started ticking.